Okay.
Does this go online? Is that one?
Yeah, it's going to be shared with online students.
Hello, online students. Yeah, I thought I would talk, or we could have a conversation pretty informally about academic publishing. It is something that I think as a graduate student, especially as PhD students, that you should be thinking about, if not already doing. But I know that from my experience as a graduate student, it was something that seemed kind of scary and opaque and easier to learn from your mistakes, but there are lots of mistakes that you don't need to make if someone kind of alerts you to them. So I thought we could talk about that today. Have any of you guys been involved in the peer review publishing process in some way? Yeah. What were your experiences? I don't know your name.
I'm Jessica.
You're Jessica.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm a master's student.
Becca, Noah, Jonathan is I thought. I don't know. Like, well, I thought John. Yeah, there it was Jonathan. Okay, I'm Britt.
Yeah.
So what were your general experiences with positive or scary or like terrifying?
So the first article that I was the first author on just like flew through, and then everything since then has been just like a monstrous challenge.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I had that happen with my first peer-reviewed article. I was the sole author, and I submitted it, and I got no revisions. They just accepted it, and that was it. And it was like, oh, this is great. And so of course every single article that literally never happens.
So the moral is fly solo.
That is not the moral at all. That's the reverse of.
Do the initial one and never publish again.
Your first one was solo? Or you were just
So
first
I
author?
was first author, but yeah, the other author was my advisor.
Okay.
for my master's.
And so that's great that was your first experience, that it was really positive and.
But it was exactly that. It was like no revisions, nothing, and then right after that came like 3 outright rejections in a row.
Right, so you can never compare, like that literally almost never happens, so do not expect that to happen, and when it does, you're just like, this is a great day. What about you guys, anything?
Yeah, so my first peer-reviewed one went through with either none or minor, I think, revisions, and kind of knew the editor, so that might have helped. He asked me to write this up, so that I'm sure helped.
That helps.
After that, the most relevant one was a buddy here came to me with a problem. I'll try to be brief. He was writing about biofuels, and he got, what's the right word, excoriated, eviscerated, I'm not sure.
This happens,
By
yes.
by one of the 2 reviewers.
Right.
The other was like minor. This one was, and it was all health and safety related. And it didn't necessarily apply, but he was not getting anywhere. So he asked me, I researched it, I said, here's what I would say if it were me. He said, hey, can you write this up and we'll make you a co-author. And I was like, okay, fine. And so I wrote it up. So the lesson learned, and it went through. Like after that, it was fine. The lesson learned is sometimes you just can't fight even when you're correct, and it's sometimes better to just say, all right, what do I have to do to appease this one reviewer, because it's always one. And then the other is, even if you do get it published, the downside is then you're going to get an email from every single international biofuels conference in the world.
Yes.
Every
All of these
week.
all of these
asking
like predatory.
oh my God, it's awful. It's just awful. I can't believe it's like whacking. Just awful. So
that
those are my 2
happens.
polar, somewhat extremes. And I'm a horrible scholarly writer. I love narrative. I prefer that. So I'm here to try to figure out what to do to get.
And we could bring more narrative to scholarly writing. I think that would be a good thing. But some reviewers are not pleased about that sometimes. But that's an interesting dilemma that I think we come across a lot with kind of a divided set of reviewers, where one reviewer has a bone to pick about every little thing, and the other ones are very positive, and it's like, what do you do with that? And I think you're right that sometimes you have to figure out how to make them feel heard when and you have to basically convince the editor when you're responding to their comments you know, we have a list of revisions, and I always like to go through and bullet point each of those revisions that have been suggested, and then respond to them in some way. And I might say something like, I don't agree with this revision. I've added these additional sources that suggest, or I'm pointing you, editor, to these additional sources that suggest that this is not a valid thing for me to look into, or, you know, I thank the reviewer for their very insightful commentary and
He did a lot of that. I was impressed as hell by that. 'Cause I was
So you
just
need
like,
to make them, I think there's kind of an art of making them feel like they're heard, but then if you don't agree with it, you don't necessarily have to adopt what they're saying.
He tried and it came back worse, if that was possible.
Okay.
It was like, this guy doesn't understand, and the editor was like, you're gonna have to address his concerns.
Right.
Do the reviewers talk to one another? Are they able to?
No.
Oh, really?
Just to the editor.
But it always seems like there's one that's.
Yeah, so they don't talk, so typically it's a double-blind process. The editor knows who is reviewing the articles. The reviewers don't know who they're reviewing, and the authors don't know who is reviewing them. They know who the editor is. And you might get comments from 3 reviewers or 2 reviewers, depending upon the journal, and then you might also get comments from the editor. And the editor might say, pay extra attention to this reviewer, or they might find that one of the reviewers is totally off base and say, you know, just deal with these for the most part.
Sure.
So you can kind of take cues from the editor, but the reviewers don't know what each other has said.
Can I flip this on its head a little bit?
Yeah.
I published after my master's degree and then went into industry and got that barrage of emails. Dr. Bruhus, Mr. Bruhus.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Just like, we want you to review all these articles. And I did some statistical modeling of freshwater discharge into the Gulf of Alaska, and was getting all these requests for review on like marine science. I was like, I had nothing to do with biology. I don't. So, and I was out of academia at that time, but still interested in keeping one foot in the door, I guess. And my boss at the office kind of talked me out of reviewing. He was like an adjunct faculty and definitely in academia a little bit still. And I was like, you don't want to waste your time with this. And I remember thinking, like, don't I? Is it a good experience? I mean, not something irrelevant to what I'm studying, but in general, do you recommend pursuing those experiences to review other articles?
Yeah, so usually the way you get on a list for a particular journal is if you submit to that journal, then one of the things that they make you do when you sign up for whatever system they're using to get your comments back through is tell them your areas of expertise. So then you go into their database. When they have an article pop up, their editors can say, oh, well, this person checks these boxes, we're gonna send it to her to review. And then the other way is that people will suggest you, or they'll do like a Google search of, sometimes you just get random invitations to review. I don't know exactly how those happen, but they happen a lot. And so I would suggest being very selective about what you review, and I say no all the time.
But would you suggest at least doing some? I
would suggest doing some. As a graduate, I mean, if it's an article that looks really interesting to you, and usually they'll send the abstract and the title. If they don't send the abstract, say, could you send me the abstract? Sometimes they'll send the whole article and you can look at it first. I would suggest, it's a useful experience to kind of understand the peer review process and what it's like when your article goes to somebody that you don't know, and what you as a peer reviewer are looking for, and what gets under your, you think of an article in a totally different way if you see 4 typos in the first page, right? You're automatically like, this person is not serious, or so I think it's a useful exercise. If it is something completely out of your wheelhouse, it's not related to your field of study, just say no. I get invitations for like statistical analysis all the time. I'm not going to be a useful person. I'm not going to have much to say about this. I get stuff about water issues in other parts of the world that I don't study. And yes, I have something to say about those. So I'm more likely to accept something like that. It depends on the journal. If it's a journal you have never ever heard of that no one reads, is probably not going to, be selective. Yeah. Does that answer your question? I mean, maybe as a graduate student, like a couple of times, but you're not going to get big credit for it. Going on your CV, people are not going to pay attention to that.
But I would say, as a more earlier career professional, say than I'm being kind to myself only here. Especially if you're still doing a lot in industry, the bar is lower in industry for exactly what would qualify. I mean, in academia, it probably wouldn't that much, but for an early career, especially in industry, they would, it might in the future bring you some benefits depending upon what direction you go in.
Well, I do very little for my CV. I don't ever approach things just for the sake of being able to talk about them, but I'm talking about the experience.
Yeah.
And that's neat to answer that it's worth it.
It's useful.
Do it.
Yes, to do a couple of times to get a sense of it. Yeah. And you can say, and you don't feel bad about leaving.
I just want to add one thing before I go.
Oh, go ahead, yeah.
Oh, I just wanted that we have an opportunity here for kind of a third avenue into getting to know publishing a little bit, because we have a journal here, the Journal of Responsible Innovation, and myself and Keita right now are editorial assistants on it, and so we deal with kind of all the triage of the journals coming in, of the articles coming in, and our term's about to end at the end of this year, so if anybody is interested in kind of that side of it, it is the grunt work side of it, but you also get to see kind of how the sausage is made, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a really interesting experience. So I edited a journal when I was in my master's program, and that was, we would actually solicit articles from people, which is very challenging. And then another really interesting experience, which I would suggest for everybody at some point, probably not as graduate students, but unless you're with a faculty member doing it, but a special issue, working on a special issue is really, really insightful for what the dynamic is between editors and writers, or editors and contributors, how to shepherd reviewers along, the whole kind of the nitty-gritty of the whole process. But to answer your question in a simple way, I think yes, there is something valuable in being on the other side of the peer review process.
So long as it's relevant.
So long as it's relevant, a 2 a year. I wouldn't do more than that. And I don't know if you get big rewards for that in industry, but in academia, it's a box you need to check. Certainly as a faculty member, maybe as a graduate student, not necessarily, but you're not going to get big points for spending. And depending upon the article, it can take quite a while. And some people, they kind of brush it off and don't take it very seriously, and those are never fun reviews to get, so you should respect the process, but also respect your own time, and don't feel bad about saying no. So,
especially when they got all the prefixes.
Right, if they haven't if they don't even know who you are, right, then just
I don't know where that came from.
delete them.
Doctor, what a promotion.
Right. And there are a lot of fake journals, and look that up first before you agree to review something. And it's always hard for me, and I know other people have this problem, to kind of turn off your copy editing hat when you're, or take off your hat when you're a peer reviewer. You don't need to rewrite their sentences or agree or disagree with their writing style. This is more about content and argument and evidence and that kind of thing.
That would be funny.
I have a hard time not doing that.
How could you imagine getting one back?
Sentence flow,
All these grammatical things. are
Yeah.
changed.
Yeah, sometimes my people get this. So I thought I would go through, I have a list of different phases of the process and things that I found really useful to keep in mind. So my first tip would be to essentially hitch your wagon to a mentor of some type, to someone who has more experience publishing academic articles, it's really hard to do it by yourself the first couple of times. And so if you can be part of the publication process on a team with several authors, even if you're the first author, someone invites you to be the first author, you have people who kind of shepherd you through the process, who know what to expect and what to look for before you're submitting. You know, so it could be your advisor, it could be just another professor that you've worked with. If you're going on the job market, the academic job market soon, and you need publications, you can email a professor that you've worked with and say, hey, are you working on anything right now that I can be helpful with? Because more times than not, they have something that they're working on, but they don't have time to finish it. And so if you say, hey, I can help you finish this, or hey, I have an idea about what direction you can take this in, they'll add you as an author. And that can be really helpful. I had an article published in a good journal when I was a PhD student, and it was from a professor that I had. She was on my committee, and she had been working on this article. She gave a presentation to a class that I was in, and she said at the end, you know, I'm thinking about how to frame this theoretically, but I don't really have any ideas. So I met with her and I said, here, I have these ideas for how you could frame this. And she said, well, why don't you write that up, and you can be first author, and it'll be great. And so it was awesome. And so finding ways to do that, I think, can be really helpful. And they're not necessarily going to come to you. Sometimes you have to ask, and it's okay to ask. You know, what are you working on? Is there anything I can be helpful with? And they might say no, but they might not. So, the next thing that I think is really important that people don't give enough attention to is picking the right journal. So you might have, you know, it might be a paper that you wrote for a class or something that you've been working on, and you know you want to get it published, and you know that there's an idea there. You need to figure out what the best avenue for that is. And the journal match is a really important piece of that. So the first thing that I do when I have an article that I want to get out, you know, think about what audience you want to reach. Do you want to reach policymakers? Is it more of kind of a theoretical piece? Is it more about practitioners? You know, who do you want to read your work? And then look up in that field or subfield, what are the top journals? And you can you can search different disciplines or subdisciplines or however you want to categorize that, you know, your own work.
Can you send a paper to multiple journals at the same time, or is it it's just the one? Okay.
Yeah, one at a time. And so that's why you have to be so careful about picking one, because it could be wrapped up for a year. And if it's the wrong one, it might take you a year to learn that.
Huh.
So reading the aims and scope of a journal is a first step. So every journal will have a website. You go to that website, it will tell you aims and scope. Look at that carefully. Decide if your your specific article fits within that, if it would be a good match. Take a look at what that journal has published recently. If they just published a special issue on water infrastructure and you have an article on water infrastructure, they're probably not going to want another article on water infrastructure. If they only publish like very theoretical pieces and your piece is very applied, they're probably not going to want that piece. So read the aims and scope, get a sense of what's been published recently in the journal, so you can go through past issues, the most recent issues. Another important question to ask, how many issues are published each year? So if it's a quarterly, they're going to be very selective about what they're publishing. If they don't nowadays a lot of journals will publish more online and sometimes fewer articles in print. So that's a good thing. But if it's a strict traditional, you know, paper quarterly, and of course they're not fully paper, they're still online, but they're gonna have they'll probably have a pretty low acceptance rate because they're not publishing that much. If it's a journal that publishes 8 times a year, then you probably have a better chance. You can look up the acceptance rate of journals. If there's a journal that you think, wow, this is a really great fit, but it has, an 8% acceptance rate, you need to be realistic and kind of honest with yourself about where you might want to aim. And it's hard to know because I feel like a lot of times when we write a paper and we want to get it published, we're really excited about it, we think it's good, and it might be, it probably is good, but is it like top 8%? Or do you want to be more realistic and go with a journal where you have a better shot and just get something out? You can look at the time from submission to publication. So some journal, I've published with journals where like their average submission to publication time is like 18 months. It's a long time. So you submit it, the reviews can take, 7 months, then you revise, then it takes 3 more months, then they don't have room in any issues. So looking up the time from time from submission to acceptance can be helpful. Just to kind of have it in your mind when you're weighing whether or not you want to target that journal. Ranking and impact is something to consider. You'll always see, it depends which website you go to, and you can just Google journal rankings. I wouldn't worry too much about that if you're aiming for a journal that's like not even on the list of top 200 journals in your field. That's maybe not going to be helpful. If it's not a legitimate, you want to publish with a legitimate journal, not some, you'll probably get like solicitations from made up journals and other places. And they're usually not worth pursuing. But you should think a little bit about that. Is it a good journal? And I wouldn't labor over that too much. The impact factor is so low. It's like, in social science, they're all pretty low.
The made-up journals kind of scare me.
Which ones?
The made-up, like the predatory journals.
Yeah, it's hard to tell.
And discerning, because it's like sometimes it'll be just like one letter off from the real ones.
Right.
So how do you discern them? I know there are lists of them online.
Yeah, but, so the way that, and there are new journals starting up all the time, and so it can be difficult to distinguish between kind of the made-up predatory ones and a new one.
This is just a new one, yeah.
And so I always look at the editorial board.
Oh, okay.
And so if there are names that I recognize on the editorial board, then I know that they're legitimate. Or even if you don't recognize the names, you can look up and see where these people are and what they're working on. So I always look at the editorial board.
Cool. Okay.
And that is a good indication of whether or not this is a real journal. If you don't know where to start with a particular article, go through your own bibliography. What journals are you citing? Have you cited 6 articles from one journal? Are you kind of directly speaking to a debate that's already going on in that journal and you just haven't realized that it's going on in that particular place? So that can be a good place to start. And then one thing that I always try to do before I submit an article, when I'm kind of narrowing it down, email an editor. So look at the editorial board, pick whoever you think is the most appropriate editor, and send them a cold email with your abstract. They don't want attachments, they want something they can read quickly, and just say, I'm thinking about submitting this article to your journal. Do you think it would be a good match? And you'll usually hear back, and if they say no, then you've just saved yourself a year.
It's really helpful, yeah.
And if they say yes, it's no guarantee, but it means that you're not wasting your time before you've even, submitted. So contacting the editor, just send an email. Simple, short, basically, am I barking up the wrong tree? And they'll usually reply in some way, and that can be really useful.
Do people ever retract or attempt to retract a submission?
after you've submitted it? Do authors?
Sure. This doesn't seem to be working. This
It's taking a long time.
I don't think I can get through.
Yeah, I've never had to do that. I have had to actively pursue editors before, where it's taken a long time. And, you know, they said it's going to take 3 months, and it's been 4 months. And so I will send an email, and I'll say, I'm just checking in on the status of this. When do you expect to have the reviews in? If you stay on them and you bother them, they want you off their back. And I've had to, you know, the editor managing that particular article, I've had to go above to the other editors before. That only happened once, and that took it was a good journal. I wanted the piece in that journal, but it was very, very, very slow. And so sometimes you do have to stay on top of editors, and if I didn't hear, you know, if I hadn't been hearing back, I might have pulled it out. I don't know. You can retract a submission.
Just yours.
Yeah, you can.
We keep talking about the year, 18 months.
Yeah.
It's a long time.
Yeah, you can retract it, but then at a certain point you've already sunk it that time,
Right.
and so you want to wait and hear. And at the end, you get reviews one way or another, and so that's essentially free feedback from 2 to 3 people who've read your article closely and have thoughts on it. You guys have any questions or any comments? Yeah?
Tons of them.
Yeah, go for
it. Can you talk a little bit about the advantages or disadvantages about going for like a journal publication versus a conference proceeding? Versus I have issues with the lack of open source information, and so maybe other forms of getting information out.
Yeah. I would say, in terms of being a graduate student looking for an academic job, a conference proceedings publication doesn't really count. Doesn't really get you anywhere. They're not peer reviewed. And then once it's in a conference proceedings, you usually don't own it anymore, and so you cannot submit it to a journal for peer review. It kind of depends. Yeah, it depends, but it's not uncommon. Some journals, and this is increasingly true, are open access. So I've done a lot of work with a journal called Water Alternatives that is freely downloadable around the world and has a great international following for that exact reason. I would say that, you know, my practical advice as a graduate student is that you don't really have the luxury of tying your actions to your beliefs in this case, because, you know, you can't put a disclaimer on your CV when you apply to jobs that says, I don't submit to non-open source journals. All they're gonna see is you don't have any peer-reviewed publications.
That's if you're going for an academic
If you're going for an academic job. Yeah, and if you're not going for an academic job, then that can be completely different. So, you know, there are other forms of publication, so I think it's really important to share ideas in a more popular, with a more popular audience in more accessible ways. So I publish with like the World Water Forum, different, and those are not peer-reviewed publications, but they have a huge international audience. I've done like big international blog posts, and those are not without value, certainly. I think even if you had one peer-reviewed article and you had a whole bunch of that other stuff, that would be good, you know. But if you have, it counts for something. So there are definitely ways you can go, you know, looking for professional organizations or international organizations that have some type of publication system or white paper series, and trying to publish with them. And with those, usually you have to figure out who the editor is, which is not always easy, so you might have to email a bunch of people and say, can you point me to the right person?
Take me to your leader.
Right. And then you make a pitch. And then they tend to be shorter, less academic in their tone, but often get a much broader audience. So those can be really great.
And then another question on the line of, you were saying it varies, but conference proceedings kind of start to own that paper. How do you navigate overlap? Like you use a data set,
right?
And you can use some of that information for one paper.
Right.
Or you could use a different,
Right. Yeah, I think. Hi.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. I think that is something that's kind of, there aren't any hard rules on. Mm-hmm. You can use the same data set. You probably want to make a slightly different argument or come at it from a slightly different angle, as long as you're not copying and pasting from work that's published elsewhere, your own work that's published elsewhere. It's fine to have, lots of people have overlap in their work, but they have two articles that use the same data but come at things from a slightly different angle or focus on something in a slightly different way, and that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah. It needs to feel, you don't want to plagiarize yourself, but if you're, pointing to that other article that's already out, but showing that this is different in some way.
Because this happened to me recently. I just got accepted at a conference that I'm not sure I want to go to. I think it's a great experience, great process, totally worth it on all those levels. But I wanted to write something else about this paper, and I was kind of encouraged to write this one thing. Right. And that was eye-opening for me. Like, oh, of course, I'm new to qualitative research, but this is all just data, and you can do a bunch of different things with that data. Right. And this is just one of them, and I was scared that going this would keep me from doing the thing I actually wanted to do. Right. But it sounds like
no. And not all conferences will automatically take your paper and put them into a conference proceedings. Mm-hmm. So you can find out, and you can usually opt out.
Oh, okay.
Maybe.
Sometimes.
Can be frowned upon if it's unexpected.
Yeah, it kind of depends on the conference, but you could contact the conference organizer and kind of express your concern and see what they have to say. Any other questions? We're talking about academic publishing.
Yes. I know about that, but okay. I had class before.
Oh no, it's no problem. Yeah, you're fine. Are there other questions before I move on to the next point? So I had said, when you're picking a journal to submit to, you think it's good to think about the audience. What audience do you want to engage with? But then you want to write for the right audience. Mm-hmm. So you could have the same article, and it could be written in two very different ways depending upon which specific journal you're submitting to. So what is the style of the journal? Is it very formal? What is the typical format or layout of articles that are published in that journal? So if you look at 3 or 4 articles that have been recently published and they all are broken up into the same subsections, you might want to think about following that to some degree. Who is cited in this journal? Are there big debates that you need to make sure that you're speaking to? Like the editors of the journal wrote something really important about the topic that you're writing on, and you should probably cite that in there somewhere. Basically, you need to make sure that you're showing the editors and you're showing the reviewers that you're submitting to the right place, that it makes sense for you to have your article published there, that it's a good, you're kind of making the case by writing in a style that fits with that journal.
How problematic is it when if you choose to not go one route with a journal and that you've written for that style, and that if you, or is usually like the kind of selection of journals that you're applying to have this a similar enough writing style that it's like transferable? Or?
Yeah, I think usually you don't have to change the whole style. Most commonly, the biggest pain when you decide to submit to a different journal is changing the citation style. That can be an enormous pain in the butt.
Wow, okay.
So, you know, some journals, I don't know why they use the styles they use, but it can take like days to reformat all the in-text citations, and it's not great. And you can use like reference managing software, but for the in-text citations and that kind of thing, you still have to go through manually and do it. So.
Are you sure? I feel like
maybe I'm out of date on that.
What do you? I mean, I'm like still
I
learning.
do have a colleague who uses one, and it automatically highlights the in-text citations when she sends me her draft. So it might change that. I've never the issue. So if you can pick a really good bibliographic management software now,
right,
and stick with it, then you're good. But once you, I used to use RefWorks and I used to use EndNote like way back 10 years ago or something, and I kind of fell off with both of them. And so at this point, for me to input all of the articles that I cite, it would be extremely laborious. And so I have not done that, and so I just do it manually every time, and I have this kind of like paper system, and it's not efficient. And it usually ends up with me like giving it to a grad student and saying, hey, can you help me out with this?
You could go to our library and ask for Renee Tanner, and she could probably help you or point you in the right direction.
To the right, the best software.
I've been using Zotero.
Yeah, people love Zotero.
And that seemed it looks like it does it.
People love Mendeley. Mendeley's been around a while. Yeah.
So I tested it out because I was just playing around with and it updated for the ones that, I mean, when I did it right.
Yeah.
It's like a little bit of a learning curve, but.
Yeah, so if you can get it on that now, that's awesome. Do it. Do it.
Zotero just can't go out of business.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And you can, and my problem was that my RefWorks account was linked to a university account, and then when I no longer had that university account, then it was all gone.
That's good advice.
So, yeah. Okay, so my next, how are we on time? We're good. My next, like, big important tip here is to get feedback before you submit your article. So I think everybody feels somewhat insecure about their own writing or their own piece before it's been kind of formally validated. And so it can be scary to share it with peers or to share it with an advisor. But you absolutely do not want the first pair of eyes on that paper to be your peer reviewers, because you've just wasted your time, because you have just sent your paper into a black hole for a year, potentially. And if it's not the best possible version, you're not doing yourself any favors. So, getting multiple eyes on your paper before you submit it, getting feedback, and you can ask for feedback on specific things, and don't try to get feedback from like Dave or somebody who you know is going to be really, really busy and probably not going to have time to read your article. And when I ask for feedback, I don't send my paper to like 4 people at the same time. Send it to one person, get that person's feedback, incorporate that feedback, then send it to somebody else. Incorporate that feedback, think about it some more. You don't necessarily have to send it to everybody in the world, but a couple of pairs of eyes on it. Even if it's, like your partner who does something completely different, like, hey, could you look at this? Is there something that doesn't make sense to you? Because chances are your peer reviewer may not be an expert in your very specific field, so it's okay to get people who don't have that expertise. You might want one person who does, who could say, you might want to cite this, or kind of more specific input, but you really want to get feedback before you submit. Yeah. When I was so I used to be at CSPO here a long time ago, before I was a master's student. And actually, this was probably why my first peer-reviewed article got accepted without revisions. We used to have a thing called the WIP, and it was the work in progress session. And it was wonderful, and it was such a small group then that it was faculty, postdocs, like undergrads, everybody would come around the table upstairs, or maybe it was in social sciences, it was a long time ago. And a different person every month or every 2 weeks would bring an article that they wanted to, a manuscript that they wanted to submit, and everybody would read it as though they were a peer reviewer and give, and you would tell them, this is the journal that I want to submit to, and you would essentially get peer reviewed, and that is really useful, and that's something that people might be more likely to participate in than getting a paper in their inbox and thinking, oh my god, I have to sit down and read this 30-page paper now and give like detailed feedback, or Noah's gonna hate me. And so even like when I was a PhD student, we had I think we called it surgery, and it was a student-led work in progress event that we had every once in a while, where one person would have to present, or you had to sit there, you weren't allowed to speak, I think that's what it was. And so you could hear how your paper read and what your idea, how other people were interpreting what you had written.
Oh, that's cool, so you can't justify it.
Right,
like.
so you can't say, well, no, that's not what I meant. But if a whole table of people is saying, it seemed like this is what you meant, then you probably need to pay attention to that.
That's really cool.
So you guys as graduate students could organize something like that, where the students, everybody buys in, and then once a month or every 2 weeks, it's somebody else's turn to get their piece workshopped, and that can be really, really valuable. And sometimes, you can invite faculty. Sometimes they might come, sometimes they might not. But just getting eyes on your work before you submit it, I think, is really important. So after you submit your article, or in the process of submitting it, you'll often get asked to suggest reviewers. Do not suggest, my advice would be to not suggest like the biggest name in the field that you're building this paper off of this person's idea. You probably don't want those people reviewing your paper. So you can either suggest no one, in which case the journal and the editors will try to think of people that they know who work in this space, or they'll search their journal database, like who pops up under keywords, climate change, safety, whatever it might be. Or you can suggest peers that who, people who are at the same level or a little bit early career people, who you think are not likely to be overly critical or take issue with every little thing, but generally think in the same way. You don't want to pick somebody that you're arguing against necessarily, and it doesn't mean that the editors will actually send the article out to those people, but editors are people with time crunches too, and so they don't, if you're telling them, here you can ask these people, they're going to ask those, they're likely to ask those people first before they have to sit down and come up with their own people to ask. So you can either suggest nobody or try to be thoughtful about who you are suggesting. But I would, you don't need to give it too much thought, but don't pick like really big names or people that you're arguing against who are going to be like offended by your article. Yeah. Any thoughts or questions or?
What's the rule with like how close you are to like for like if it's someone on your committee, like how much attention do they pay to that?
If it's someone who can probably identify who you are without your name appearing on the article, then it's probably too close.
That's fair.
So I've certainly gotten articles before where I'll read through it and I'll think, oh, I think I know who wrote this, but the person hasn't told me that they've written it. I haven't seen any drafts of it. You know, if a reviewer can say, I know who wrote this article, they'll probably recuse themselves. So I've gotten, I think one time I had an article that went out for review and it went to my advisor. And she knew it was my, and I didn't suggest her, they were like, oh, this seems like a good match. And she said, I can't review this article, you know, so you can't suggest, like, your friends, or, you know, they should be people at a professional distance.
Yeah, I guess I was just wondering, if it's like in the same department, like if that's okay, or if that's considered like skeezy to.
No, I think if the editor sees that you've suggested like 3 people in your department, they're probably not going to invite those 3 people to review it. You know, they want to preserve the process too. But I think as long as the reviewer cannot identify who has written the article, then it's probably okay. Any other thoughts on that? No. Okay, so you picked your journal, you've tailored your article, you've submitted it, and then you wait, and you wait, and you wait. And sometimes you have to check in with the editor, and that's fine. You know, it's part of what they deal with. You don't want to nag them like every day, but you know, I will put it on my if an editor says check back with me in 4 weeks, I will put it on my calendar in 4 weeks, check back with this person. Like, you have to stay on them sometimes. But not the most likely outcome, but one possible outcome after you've waited and waited and waited is rejection, right? Like, straight up rejection. My advice for that is to not get frustrated, to not doubt yourself or your ideas, and don't take it personally. So everybody gets rejected, like, all the time. Even the biggest names, they get rejected. And it doesn't mean you don't have a good idea. It might mean you picked the wrong journal. It might mean they sent it to 3 reviewers who were not the appropriate people to review the article, who didn't understand it, or who didn't take the time to actually read it. You know, sometimes you'll get a really frustrating review that says, well, you need to tell me you didn't answer this question or this question or this question. It's like, well, actually those are my first 3 paragraphs. You know, like, they clearly did not read it. I one time had a reviewer say that I clearly was not a native English speaker.
Oh my god.
Which
Interesting.
I actually, I don't think so. But I had a good laugh.
Oh man.
About that one, because
How does the editor even let that go through?
I don't know. But every, you know, just remember things like that. Sometimes you just get a weird review, and sometimes you get pretty weird reviews. But don't take it personally. What I like to do with a full rejection is to read through it once, because usually, you know, when I was newer to this process, I'd open a rejection. Man, I don't want to look at this. Like, get away from me. But read through it once, and then leave it alone. Like, don't open it. Don't touch the article. Just leave it alone for, it might be like a couple days, it might be a few weeks, it might be like 2 or 3 months. However long you need to, like, get that space from it, and so you're not emotional about it, just leave it alone. And then go back. And it's interesting because a lot of times, you know, when you first read the comments, you're like, well, that's not true, that's not true. But then you go back and you read them, and you're like, it's a little bit true. And so go back when you have some distance from it, and work on improving the article based on those comments. Basically, they're offering free input. It's not always good input, but a lot of times it is. So use it. And even if it's a total misinterpretation of your article, there's probably a reason why they didn't get it. You were not articulating it clearly. Pick a new journal, revise for that specific journal. Hopefully don't spend like days and days changing your reference style if you have the software. And then you start the process again. So you submit it all over again. Yeah, so the rejection is not something to be defeated by. Everybody will go through that. And I would just suggest like giving it some space and then seeing what you can gain from that, from those comments. And sometimes, you know, sometimes you're like, maybe this was a really crappy article that shouldn't be published. But usually that's not the case. There's usually something salvageable in there somewhere. And then another outcome is that you'll get revisions. You can get minor revisions, you can get major revisions. It doesn't really matter what to call them. You just have to change some things. This can feel frustrating too, but it is a good outcome. Like that is what you want. You will almost never get an article accepted as is. It doesn't happen very often. So if you get revisions, you should celebrate. That's good. It means there's hope. It will probably be published in that journal at some point. Again, don't take the comments personally. It's okay not to change the article in every way the reviewer suggests. You just need to justify it to the editor. So what I said this before, what I like to do is kind of read through everybody's comments and then make a separate Word file that has 2 columns. And in one column it is a bullet point for each of the suggested changes. And in the other column it is my response to those changes. And this is a document that you need to send to the editor to show them that you have gone through and paid attention to each thing that the reviewers have said. And sometimes the reviewers will say the same thing, and so it's just one bullet point for that. And so it might be adding citations. It might be a reviewer saying, why don't you work on what I work on? Which happens a lot. It's like, you should have written about this, but you don't necessarily have to. Again, it's kind of about making them feel heard, even if you can say, that's a great point, I'm going to think about that for a future article, but the scope of this, that's beyond the scope of this article, that's beyond the scope of this work, or I need additional data for that, that's not currently available, or so, you know, something like that. You need to justify why you're not making that change if you choose not to.
And they get to see those responses that you send back?
The editor will see those responses. Most of the time, this isn't always the case, but most of the time, the reviewers themselves don't see your response.
Okay.
So the editor will take the reviews and take your response to it and then decide whether or not you have adequately addressed those things. Sometimes, if it's like pretty major revisions, they'll send it back to the reviewers to look at. Again, what you don't want to happen, and I've had this happen, is that they send it out to different reviewers. And so that's something that you can communicate with the editor and say, if this is going to go back out for review, can you please make sure it goes back to the same reviewers? And sometimes they might say, no, I can't do that. But you can always ask, because this happened to me one time. I got a set of reviews, I addressed all those comments, I sent it back in, they sent it to 1 or 2, they were major revisions, they sent it out to other reviewers who of course are coming at it with a totally different perspective and have a whole set of different comments, because and you'll understand this when you go through when you review yourself, you are not, you're given the task of reviewing an article. You're not going to say, oh, check, this is great, good to go. You're going to point out little things here and there every time, no matter what. And so if it goes back out to different reviewers, they're still going to come back and say minor revisions.
That's so
They're just going to be different revisions because they're different people. And so if there is a way to ask an editor to say, can you make sure it goes back out to the same reviewers, that can be really helpful.
Yeah, that seems costly on like, the
Save you some
journals
frustration.
end
Yeah.
to have new reviewers
So
come in. And
sometimes they'll ask you, if you are a peer reviewer, they'll say, when you submit your recommendation, you can say, accept with minor revisions or accept with major revisions. It'll say, are you willing to review this article again?
Oh, wow.
And if you say no, then the editor cannot ask you again.
Oh, no.
But sometimes they don't even ask that, and so it really should be up to in my opinion, it's something that the editor should be able to manage. Like, has this person addressed these reviewers' concerns? And it shouldn't go through the process all over again. But that does happen, so it's something to be aware of. Are there any questions about the revision process or rejection or any of that stuff?
I was wondering, I'm sure it varies greatly by discipline and by journal, but like generally, like what are the percentages of like rejected flat out versus revisions, or maybe in your experience,
Yeah.
ballpark numbers?
I think it varies greatly depending upon the journal. And so you can bring down your probability of flat out rejection by taking care of a lot of it on the front side. So, emailing the editor before you submit it. If they say this is not a good fit, you've just saved yourself a flat out rejection.
Right.
It might have taken a year to come. Making sure that you have picked the right journal, because a lot of times when you are the peer reviewer, they'll say, is this a good match for this journal? That is one of the questions. Does it belong in this journal? It could be a great article, but if this is not the right place to publish it, they're not going to accept it. So there are things you can do to lower the probability of flat out rejection. And then you can look at the acceptance rate. So again, if it's a 10% acceptance rate, you need, is this article in the top 10% of like scientific, is it a breakthrough that should be published in Nature right now? If you're with a team of people who've successfully published in that journal several times, go ahead and submit to Nature, or if you have advisors saying like, this is a big deal, this is a really good article, then maybe you can go ahead and do that. But being realistic about where to submit, I think, is important. I don't know how many are just like flat out. It really depends. Flat out rejections.
If that's the anomaly, if that's
my flat out rejections have mostly come as a graduate student, like an early graduate student, and I would write a term paper that I thought was really good, and then like beef it up a little bit, and then submit it to get published in like a very good journal. These before I learned these things, and they'd be like, you don't have any empirical evidence from your research, or where did this, one thing that is very commonly a sticking point for reviewers is methods. If you don't clearly explain your methods, and this is especially true in social science, where like the methods kind of seem clear, like you interviewed people, like you need to spell that out in a serious way at the beginning, and that will help to make the case for the rigor of your study and your paper. And I, as a graduate student, that was not something that was at the fore of my mind when I was submitting these like glorified term papers. And these were things that, when I got, you get an A on it, and then you think that that is a justification to submit it, but if you are writing it for a particular journal, you're giving it to people saying, I want to publish it in this journal, can you give me your feedback? These are all things that you can do to bring that term paper up to the level of being a publishable study. And it's not at all to say that there are papers that you'll write in your classes that cannot be published. They're often great starting points for that, but there are lots of things to consider before bringing it to that point.
I'm working now in 2 papers. One is for a 1-year class. It's not my first part was not an A, but I'm looking for publish that. And now in this semester I focus the second part of the project in an empirical part. But I know that the issue is something that it's not published before. It's contingent, and also there are a lot of evidence in this country, but in my country no, that is like a trend. But to me now is the issue how to address my because it's a policy paper with document analysis and interviews. How to address the interviews to become the article enough strong empirically. That is something that could be related to methods, but also it's like how to package the history in a reliable history. That is something that I try to figure out now. It's science policy paper, and how to find adequate journal for this kind of papers, because it's not for a mainstream journal, but my idea is like try to figure out a journal that actually could be interested, but it's not also like a little journal. It's like
somewhere in the middle.
Yes. How to find that kind, because the little one looks for students, and they like send mails and say like, oh, you can send something, and the biggest one, I don't think I read. But how to find the middle in a field.
Yeah. So if you however you would define that field, you say science policy or whatever field you want to call it, you can do a search of the journals. Like when I'll do searches for like human geography, development, water policy. No matter how you break it up, there will probably be a list that will show up through a Google search that will show you the top 200 journals that somehow fit into that category. Sometimes some of them you're like that doesn't belong there, but usually they're relevant journals. And then you can get information on things like the ranking, the impact factor. I said this before, how many issues are published each year? If they're publishing more issues each year, then they'll probably have a higher acceptance rate. And then go and pick, it might be that you pick 10 potential journals to submit to, and then you go and you read their aims and scope. So each journal will have a website. Read their aims, read their scope, read the abstracts of the last 20 articles they've published, and figure out if they're thinking in the same space that you're thinking in, if their audience is the same audience that you want to target. And then you can pick a few of those and email the editors and say, here's my abstract, what do you think? And so one of the good things about the double-blind peer review process as a graduate student is they don't know that you're a graduate student. So you don't need to tell the editor that you're a graduate student when you send that in. There would be a bias. That's why, they don't know if you're a full professor. They have no idea. So don't do anything or say anything in your paper that betrays that, I would say. And on the first point with interviews, so that is a very legitimate, potentially rigorous qualitative method. I would suggest that you have, even if it's just a paragraph or 2 paragraphs, in a subsection called methods or methodological approach, that you went out and you did this many interviews, they were structured, semi-structured, whatever they were. How did you identify your interview subjects? How long were the interviews? Any detail that you can give on that approach, and then justifying why you used that approach and why it was a good match for the kinds of questions you were trying to answer. That's all you need. That's all you need to put. And any work that you did as field work, you were in your country doing these interviews. Who were you interviewing? That is new data that hasn't been published somewhere else, and so they need to know that. And so sometimes a mistake that I've made early on is it's not clear. You undersell yourself. You don't say that you went out and you conducted these interviews. You can say, you'll quote someone and say, according to this person, blah, blah, blah. But it's not clear that you extracted that information from an interview. So it needs to be clear that that is original and that is something new that you are adding to the conversation. Another thing that gets left out of papers a lot that is a sticking point with reviewers that will result in rejection or revision is like the so what question. So you can have a really interesting article, but if it's all narrative with no argument, they're not going to publish it. Like, what is your argument? Say it in your introduction. I will argue, or like in this paper, we argue this. I will make this argument by talking about this, 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 and this, by addressing the historical context. That's important because it helps me make this argument. Make the argument, and then say again at the end why that is an important argument, what it will contribute to, who cares about this argument? Who is it speaking to? You can say, well, it will help people working in this space or this space or this space think about something they haven't thought about before, and because they haven't thought about it, we're seeing all these problems. But if they did think about it, maybe it would help. So justifying, being clear about what your argument is, how you're going to make it, and then why it's important. Like, why should anybody care about your argument? Is it just like interesting? Like, that's not enough. And you don't have to make like 4 different arguments. Those can be 4 different articles. Yeah, what else? My last thing is acting as a reviewer. So if you get invited to be a peer reviewer, I think it is a useful exercise, but be discriminating in what you agree to review, and think, bring it with you the next time you submit an article. In your experience as a reviewer, what were you looking for? What was missing? And then try to read your own article, your own manuscript as a reviewer.
Something about reviews, because sometimes I receive some articles that invite me to review, but some of them are out of my area of interest. If I'm interested also in a journal, it's like not immediately, like in a medium term, like this journal is related to my main research focus. Like, I know that the reviewers are part of the community. It's a good idea to try to also communicate to that kind of editors now and say like, oh, I'm researching this area, this is my background. Like, offer as reviewer in that kind of journals.
You mean to contact the editors and say that you're interested in reviewing?
Yes, because some journals have that that kind of thing, but the main journals no. If I'm interested, like for example, if I know journals that are interested to publish my dissertation in 4 years more, like to become more close to that community, and it's a good idea. Right.
I don't know if it would be worth it. I mean, the editor-in-chief would probably be different 4 years down the road. If you get invited to review an article and it's an editor that you know is somebody that you'll be interacting with in some way in the future, if I don't want to review an article, I'll do a personal reply and I'll say, my schedule doesn't allow me to review this article right now, but please feel free to keep me in mind for future reviewing opportunities, or you can keep me on your list or something like that, rather than just clicking the like, no, I'm not gonna do it button. Then, you know, I don't know if that helps or doesn't help, but if they are reviewing your tenure file 4 years, 5 years down the road, and they think, oh, this person will never review for me, they're a pain in my ass, then, you know, maybe that helps. I don't know. But I don't know that there's huge benefit to be gained from like actively trying to connect with those journals and review articles. Sometimes you'll get invited to be on an editorial board. That probably doesn't happen much as a graduate student. And that can be useful because you can steer the direction of the journal itself, and then you have more personal communication with the editors themselves, and you kind of make a name for yourself in the community a little bit more. But as a blind peer reviewer, nobody's going to know that you were doing that, which doesn't mean it's not important to do a couple of times just to get the experience, or a couple of times a year. But I wouldn't spend a lot of time trying to do that. A more useful way, I think, to kind of get your name known in a community, you know, whatever your sub-communities are that you work in, you know, specialty groups through like organizational affiliations, so like the AAAS or 4S, you know, whatever the organizations are that you belong to. Sometimes they'll have like a graduate student organization, and you can be elected to, you know, be the treasurer or be whatever. And just by sheer volume of like emails that go out on those listservs, people will recognize your name. They'll say, "Oh, what's that person doing?" Or you're kind of more on people's radar that way. But peer reviewing is probably not a great way to get on people's, to get your name out there. Not an effective way. Yeah. Other thoughts or questions?
That was super helpful. That was super.
Does it seem don't be scared. Yeah. No, I think a lot of the things we've talked about can be enormously helpful in increasing your chances for successfully getting something out the door, and it feels really good when you do. So just like hold on to that feeling, because it will come again. Yeah.
I like the whip idea.
Yeah, I think it'd be great if the grad students organized something like that and invited faculty to participate as they could.
And so you guys did it bi-weekly or monthly?
I don't remember. It was probably monthly, and it was like 10 years, 12 years ago. It was literally 12 years ago now. Yeah,
That's awesome.
but I found it to be helpful. So
Thank you so much.
Awesome.
yeah, thank you guys. If anything else comes up,
Say goodbye to the good people in life.
yes, bye, good people.
That's